Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Monday, the 1st of December. I'm Caroline Hepker in London.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Brussels. Coming up today, the UK's Chancellor Rachel Reeves is forced to deny she was dishonest with the public about the state of the government finances ahead of last week's budget.
US and Ukrainian negotiators took up productive discussions on ending the war with Russia.
Plus, holding on to peak net worth in the Alps, Switzerland votes to reject a 50% inheritance tax on the super rich.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The UK's Chancellor Rachel Reeves is facing calls to resign following accusations she misled the public about the state of the country's public finances ahead of her budget. The controversy erupted after the head of economic analysis at the Office for Budget Responsibility told Bloomberg Radio that the underlying forecasts presented to the Chancellor had not changed after she raised the prospect of an income tax hike in a highly unusual pre-budget speech and interview. Following that revelation, the OBR on Friday released the forecast it had provided to the Chancellor in the lead-up to the budget, showing that she already knew she was on course to meet her fiscal rules at the time of the speech. Yesterday, Sky News' Trevor Phillips asked Reeves whether Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch's accusation that she lied to the public ahead of the budget to justify increasing taxes to fund welfare spending was accurate.
Look, I'm a Labour Chancellor. I want to reduce child poverty. I make no apologies for that. This will be the biggest ever reduction in child poverty in a parliament ever. And I'm proud to be the Chancellor that lifts 500,000 kids out of poverty. That means kids not going to bed hungry. It means kids not waking up in cold and damp homes. And I am proud and I'm very happy to defend the choices I've made.
I just asked you, did you lie? And I have to say, the answer I was looking for was no. No. I didn't hear the word no.
But you also asked about welfare in that question.
No, I just asked you, did you lie?
Of course I didn't.
Reeves was speaking as initial polling from YouGov showed that only 21% of the British public see her budget as fair.
The fallout from the budget comes as the Prime Minister Keir Starmer is signalling a renewed push to curb welfare spending in the UK. In excerpts released ahead of a speech that he'll deliver later today, Starmer is expected to pledge to cut Britain's rising benefits bill, which climbed further in the budget after the decision to lift the two-child benefits cap. The party is now scrambling to blunt criticism that the budget increased welfare spending whilst raising taxes on working people. Meanwhile, the Office for Budget Responsibility says that total welfare spending is forecast to reach £333 billion this year and rise to £406 billion by 2030.
US and Ukrainian negotiators say they had productive discussions about a framework for a peace deal with Russia, but there was no final breakthrough as President Donald Trump continues to push for an end to the war. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke to reporters in Florida after the talks.
So this is not just about ending a war. This is about ending a war in a way that creates a mechanism and a way forward that will allow them to be independent and sovereign, never have another war again, and create tremendous prosperity for its people. Not just rebuild the country, but to enter an era of extraordinary economic progress. It's a country Ukraine has tremendous economic potential. Ukraine has tremendous opportunity for true prosperity.
Marco Rubio was speaking ahead of a trip to Moscow by US envoy Steve Witkoff this week for further discussions with Russia. It comes as the US is reducing its military presence in Europe, asking other NATO countries to step up for the continent's defence.
Now, President Trump says that he has made his choice for the next chair of the Federal Reserve. Without giving a name or a timeline, Trump told reporters on Air Force One that he will be making an announcement. White House Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett is seen as the likely choice to succeed current Fed Chair Jerome Powell. Speaking to CBS over the weekend, Hassett declined to address whether he was the frontrunner, but said that markets are ready for the president's decision.
We had a great Treasury auction, interest rates went down. And so I think that the American people could expect President Trump to pick somebody who's going to help them, have cheaper car loans and easier access to mortgages at lower rates. And that's what we saw in the market response.
White House Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett there. President Trump has criticised Jerome Powell repeatedly and made clear that he expects his nominee to forcefully pursue interest rate cuts.
Switzerland has voted to reject a 50% inheritance tax on super-rich residents after wealthy entrepreneurs threatened to leave the country. Official figures show more than 3/4 of the electorate opposed the measure. Bloomberg's Freddie Fulston has more.
Switzerland's Young Socialists had proposed the levy as a way of raising funds to fight climate change. The plan had been to tax all inherited or gifted assets exceeding 50 million francs, but it faced staunch opposition over the weekend. Critics arguing the departure of the wealthy would offset any tax gains and leave the country worse off. For now, at least, the vote has eased any concerns about Switzerland's status as a haven for the global rich. In London, Freddie Fulston, Bloomberg Radio.
Those are our top stories for you this morning. Looking at the markets, it looks like a difficult start to December. S&P 500 E-mini futures are currently down by 0.7%. Euro Stoxx futures are also down 0.3. The Nikkei 225 declining almost 2% in a sell-off in Japan. 10-year US Treasury yields up 3 basis points at 4.04. We are expecting important data out this week for the US, including inflation and consumer demand. So that's likely to shape the expectations for the rate cutting cycle from the Fed. The dollar is a bit firmer. The pound is down 0.1%. Gold is also lower, and Bitcoin taking another hit this Monday morning, trading just above $86,000, dropping 5.5%. Those are the markets.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on how our interview with the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility has sparked a political storm. Plus, we'll have the latest on the Ukraine peace talks. Another story I've been reading this morning, in case on this Monday morning you're tempted to pull the covers over the head and ignore everything that might be happening in the outside world. You're not alone. There's a theory. It's the ostrich effect. We're all ignoring more things, and in particular, the news. That's something that Alex Stone has been writing about on Bloomberg Weekend. I mean, this is a conversation I'm hearing more and more of. People saying, they love saying it's journalists, obviously.
Yes.
I don't read the news anymore. Great. But it's something that's, a broader psychological effect. And actually, Alex has been digging into some of the research by psychologists around this as well, and how because of people having problems essentially being exhausted by the endless flood of headlines, that this is selective ignorance as essential as critical thinking, maybe.
Well, I think it's just surprising that apparently 4 out of 10 people are not really tuned into the news, according to this Reuters survey, apparently. Yes, I do hear that also from, friends and acquaintances who'll say, I don't listen to the news, and I never know what to do, Stephen.
Obviously. They always
I never know whether to try to convince them that they should be, and that there's a reason to be well informed or not.
Well, look, I think the point that Alex kind of comes to at the end of this as well is that it's about picking what you choose to engage with. And we hope you'll continue listening to us as well. But something to think about as well, this is perhaps one of the reasons that older people are often happier, because despite having perhaps a greater exposure to bad news, people are simply more selective about what they take in.
Right. I think that's a great story. We're going to put a link to it in our show notes. But if you were listening last week, you might have heard our interview with David Miles of the Office for Budget Responsibility after the UK budget on Thursday. There was one key question in that conversation about the revised forecast for the UK's fiscal watchdog, the OBR, that they provided to the Chancellor, and how that influenced her pre-budget speech and her decisions running up to budget day. And I want you to listen to it now. Here is what David Miles told us.
Well, the pre-measures estimate, that is, how much is the balance between government spending and tax revenues before the government has implemented any new policies. That number was for just being on the right side of the target, but by a wafer-thin amount of about £4 billion, which is very small in the context of an economy that's 3 trillion billion large. So that forecast was not that there would be an obvious miss on the government target, but that most of the headroom had essentially gone. And that was there back in toward the end of October. Of course, that meant that in order to rebuild headroom, there had to be a sort of net tightening in policy. Obviously, there are many ways that the government could choose to fill the gap, if you will.
So sorry, are you saying that there wasn't an improved forecast offered?
Well, the forecast, the pre-measures estimate, which is what the government would look at and see, well, how much have we got to play with? What do we need to do if they decide to try and build up headroom? That was just about the right side of hitting the target, but by a wafer-thin margin.
So that was David Miles, Head of Economic Analysis at the OBR, speaking to you, Caroline, last week. And I saw the headlines from this story from the Canary Islands, where I was last week as well. Why was this such a key moment?
So this was the revealing moment from the Office of Budget Responsibility, because it shows that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, had consistently favourable economic forecasts before she made both her budget speech but also the unusual pre-budget speech that she made that we played for you here live on Bloomberg Radio. So basically, it left a lot of people, including our own reporter Phil Aldrich, with questions about what was the reason then for delivering a major tax increasing budget if actually the forecasts were a little bit rosier than a lot of economists had been expecting. And that was what David Miles was saying when he was sitting down in the radio studio with me. In the run-up to the budget, you'll remember on the 26th of November, there was just constant media speculation about what the Chancellor was going to do. There was a concern that there would be another big budget black hole, as there was last time around. This time, the worry was around whether there'd be a big productivity downgrade. The Chancellor chose to make this unusual pre-budget speech where she hinted at an income tax increase, and she talked about hard choices. She spoke to the media about this. But actually, we now know from what David Miles said and then from what the correspondence was from the OBR after that interview, that the Chancellor privately knew and was told by the budget watchdog that the fiscal position was actually a bit better than had expected. In the meantime, she actually dropped the idea of that big tax increase. And so the conclusion is really that the Chancellor chose to spend on welfare, both in the U-turns earlier this year, but also scrapping that limit on benefits for larger families. She also spent on increasing her fiscal headroom. £16 billion was the uplift overall in terms of welfare spending. And you also have to remember that there was a financial markets issue. There was a guilt rally around that idea that there could be an income tax increase. Investors backed the idea of that rise in early November. There was a gilt rally that then unwound. And it all basically forced Downing Street on Friday to reject the idea that the Chancellor had misled the public and financial markets over the course of that whole period running up to the budget. And so over the weekend, this was the sort of question that Rachel Reeves got, and this is what she said.
Tackling the cost of living, which is why I took £150 off of energy bills and froze prescription charges. I wanted to continue to cut NHS waiting lists, and I wanted to bring borrowing down. £4 billion of headroom would not have been enough.
So that was Rachel Reeves, the UK Chancellor, effectively saying that even that slightly rosier forecast, that £4 billion, was not enough in her view. She needed a bigger fiscal buffer and she wanted to do various other things, but that was her response.
And of course, this is a story that seems to be continuing to rumble on as well. We're expected to hear from the Prime Minister on this later today too.
Yeah, the Prime Minister's going to make a speech today. The excerpts show that he's going to focus on a renewed push to curb welfare spending. I mean, it's basically also to revive his leadership. The budget, it must be said, was not well received by voters. If you look at the polling, Nigel Farage of Reform UK has called for an investigation into Rachel Reeves's pre-budget comments. He wants Laurie Magnus, the independent advisor on ministerial standards, to look at this. And in terms of Keir Starmer, he's going to talk about this benefits bill. If you look at the OBR's forecast, £333 billion of spending, that's 10.9% of UK GDP, and that's expected to rise to more than 11% of GDP by 2030. So, look, the pressure perhaps is really still on the government.
Yeah, indeed, and a story we'll be continuing to watch as well. Caroline, thanks for bringing us up to date and how that story and that interview that you did last week is now playing into the political conversation in the UK.
Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this.
I want to bring the focus, though, to Brussels here next, where EU defence ministers are meeting this morning to discuss support for Ukraine as the bloc tries to carve out a place for itself in the peace process. We've had those talks between the US and Ukraine over the weekend. US envoy Steve Witkoff leading a delegation to Russia in the coming days. Our Chief Europe correspondent Oliver Crook is with me in the Brussels studio for more. Oliver, let's start then with these talks between the US and Ukraine and Florida over the weekend. What do we know about what was discussed?
Well, what we know so far is that, of course, they're trying to adapt that plan that was originally put out about a week and a half ago, that 28-point plan that really caught the Europeans and the Ukrainians and really much of the world by surprise, probably even the Russians by surprise, to the degree that it was seen as tilted towards the Russian perspective. That has now evolved into what we understand, that living document of those 19 points of what this actual peace proposal could look like. But since then, we've not really gotten any transparency in terms of what the actual contents of this plan is. So it's very difficult to make an appraisal at how close the two sides between the United States and the Ukrainians are, apart from the fact that we keep hearing from both delegations that they're very encouraged that progress is being made. That being said, Marco Rubio over the weekend yesterday in Florida saying that there's still a decent amount of work to be done there. So we focus our attention this week on the diplomacy that will be going on. Monday, we have Zelensky in Paris meeting with Emmanuel Macron. As you mentioned, defense ministers here today. On Wednesday, Marco Rubio will actually make his way over to Brussels, where he'll be meeting with foreign ministers from Europe. And of course, we await Steve Witkoff, who's heading out there to Moscow. We should say what is drastically different this week from last week. Andrei Yermak is no longer leading the Ukrainian negotiation delegation, the number 2 within the Ukrainian president's office, resigning on Friday as he was sort of being ensnared in this corruption investigation. We should say he's not been charged with anything, but his home and his offices have been raided. That, of course, is massively damaging to the Ukrainian position.
How does then this all set us up for the talks in Russia this week?
I think it's very difficult to appraise at this point. I think that we've seen that reports that Witkoff himself could potentially be going as early as today. We don't know if that will actually happen today, or if there actually needs to be more time for these things to be fleshed out from the U.S. and the Ukrainian side before being presented to the Russians. But again, this is going to be a crucial week, I think, also for the Europeans who get the opportunity to get in front of Marco Rubio on Wednesday to try to lay out their position. Remember, that 28-point plan included a huge amount of things, not just about Ukraine, but about the charter to NATO, about what the NATO would agree to, what the European sort of defense architecture would look like. So I think from the European perspective, it's absolutely crucial to get in front of Marco Rubio, try to get their position sort of exposed, and maybe you can get a collective front here with the United States and Europe.
Well, of course, ahead of that meeting on Wednesday, we have a meeting happening this morning, which is those defence ministers gathering here in Brussels. What should we be expecting to come out of that?
I think there's going to be a lot of reassuring words. We expect the Ukrainian defence minister to be in attendance in some manner in that meeting with Denis Shmyhal, who will be discussing with them. But listen, the reality of the situation is the sort of European impact since that plan dropped about a week and a half ago has been basically completely negligible. There's been a lot of sort of encouraging rhetoric as usual. But as Prime Minister Tusk said a while ago, if all the positive words had been transferred into ammunition, that is the kind of thing that's actually going to make a difference for Ukraine. That being said, we should also say that over the weekend, Viktor Orban was where? He was in Moscow meeting with Vladimir Putin. We should also say that the Belgians who hold those frozen Russian assets have now dug into that position, saying that, maybe this is not the time to actually touch those assets and to figure out what to do with them. Let's let the peace process play out. So those are two actually quite painful and quite negative stories for the Ukrainians from the European side.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.